Hey guys, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Wednesday night Bible study this evening. The one that Harry started back up last week whenever we started back up in a book, A Remnant Shall Return. My goal is to continue this study throughout this week and or throughout tonight and in the next few weeks, and try to hopefully get to a point that whenever we get past some of these orders and we're able to meet once again on Wednesday night, that we can continue on with this book and hopefully get, when I say get through it and get on to some other material. So tonight we're going to be looking, and we're going to try to get through Nehemiah 5, chapters 5 through 7. So we'll see how this goes, and this it's a little bit different, trying to just go through a text out of a book than some of the things I've been doing, on different live sessions and videos. But hopefully you can join along, and we'll go through Nehemiah chapter 5 through 7 and hope to make some application this evening. What I would like to do before we begin is kind of review a little bit with where we are and where we've been. If you remember right, being a part of these classes, and if you haven't been, you are from outside the area, you're not from Oklahoma City and don't attend at 84th Street. We've been going through periods of this Old Testament, and we get down to where we are in the time period of the captivity and return, and that's really where we've been throughout this book, A Remnant Shall Return. And so where we are at this point in time is we're in that time period of the return. They've been taken captive, and they've gone through the years of captivity, and they've been allowed to return, and we've gone through that time period of the various returns, if you will, the three returns that we see there. But now we're at the point with Nehemiah where we see the rebuilding of the wall. And that time period that we're in, and the years that we're in right now, is about 444 BC in that time frame. Again, we always kind of start off with some different dates to remember, to kind of help us see where we are and what's going on. We see in 722 BC that we have the fall of Samaria, and that was for the Assyrian captivity. We see that there with Isaiah. We also see in 606 BC the first captives taken, and that's really where we started off with this book. There's the first captives taken in 606 BC to Babylon, and that's Daniel was along with that return. Then we see in 596 BC another group of captives taken with Ezekiel. In 586, Jerusalem's completely destroyed. And then in 536, we had that proclamation by Cyrus that allowed the children of Israel to return. And so we went through this, and again, we've gotten to that point where we have in 536 BC the children of Israel allowed to start to return under the proclamation by Cyrus. And so we see that time period and all these things happen. And then after that, again, we see the three different returns. Well, after the returns, the last one, that we talked about there, we then get into Nehemiah. And Harry talked about Nehemiah last time. He caught us all the way back up to where we are, and he gets to chapter 4, and he went through chapter 4. What we're going to go through this time is Nehemiah chapters, again, 5 through 7. What we're looking at is the completion of the wall. If you remember where we were last time and the previous time as far is with Nehemiah, and what we're seeing here and what's going on, is in Nehemiah chapter 1, you have Nehemiah hears the report of Jerusalem, and he prays, and he hears what's going on, and he hears that it's not well at that point in time, and that the walls are still destroyed and all those types of things. And so we see the prayer and the confession there in chapter 1. And Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem and encourages those around him and around the area to rise up and build. And if you remember right, in Nehemiah chapter 2, that's where Nehemiah, being in the position he was in the king's palace, the king asked him, what was wrong. Nehemiah lets him know, and the king allows him to go. So he returns, and he encourages those around him to rise up and to build. And so we see that happening in Nehemiah chapter 4. With that said, in Nehemiah chapter 3, each family, we see their different family names and everything being assigned to various portions of the wall. And then again, Nehemiah chapter 4, which Harry covered last week, going through and talking about the Jews coming under attack, but Nehemiah encourages and defends them, and the Jews are coming under attack by all those around them. And we're going to continue to see that if we get into chapter 6 tonight. So that's where we left off. right? With the rebuilding and the restructuring of the wall starting, we see that mind that they had to work. We see the fact that they were, although they were under attack from the standpoint of there were those who were trying to discourage them, who were trying to get them to stop rebuilding this wall, they continue to push through, and that's due in large part to the leadership of Nehemiah. That brings us to Nehemiah chapter 5. And we'll go through the text like we normally do, read through a couple verses here, and then we'll make some observations, applications, and then we'll move on and go through. Again, going to try to do this in under half an hour, certainly under 40 minutes, try to get through 3 chapters here. So we'll go ahead and get started in Nehemiah chapter 5 and try to get as far as we can tonight. Here in Nehemiah chapter 5, starting verse 1, we read, "And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore, let us get grain, that we may eat and live. There were also some who said, We have mortgage our lands and vineyards and houses, that we might buy grain because of the famine. There were also those who said, We have borrowed money for the king's taxes on our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. And indeed, we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards." And so we recognize that there was this outcry here. There was this outcry that came to Nehemiah's attention. And what it is it's an outcry against Jewish brethren because what was going on. We see that there was a famine. And as a result of famine, there was this need of food. And we see borrowing going on and mortgaging of home and all these different things. And we even see all these different things. For there were those, verse 2, who said, We are sons and daughters of many. So they needed food. They have mortgaged their lands. They needed money for the king's taxes and all those types of things. But one of the things that we recognize here, and there are others that were forced into slavery, or their sons and their daughters were forced into slavery. But what we see here is the borrowing and the usury and all those things. They weren't from outside people, from other nations. What their outcry is against their own brethren, against Jews, against those that would be in a position to be able to lend money in this type of way. And as a result, we see the usury that's there. So that's what we see here in verses 1 through 5. And then whenever we get over into 6 through 11, we see Nehemiah's response and reaction to this. Starting in verse 6, he says, "And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, Each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them, and I said to them, According to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now indeed will you even sell your brethren, or should they be sold to us? Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. Then I said, What you are doing is not great. Should you not walk in the fear of our God? Because the reproach of the nations of the nations, our enemies? I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore now to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses. Also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them." A lot that we have here, right? Nehemiah laying out what he is angry with and frustrated with. But I want us to start in verse 6, and we can make some application here with this. So we see the issue there in verses 1 through 5, and then we get to verse 6. "And I became very angry when I heard their outcry in these words." We see that what was going on, and that what's going on was usury, which we recognize was sinful, especially under the old law. This was something that was sinful. We see in Exodus 22:25, Leviticus 25:35 through 41, and Deuteronomy 23:19 through 20, that this was not to be done from a Jew to another Jew. You could maybe do some form of this outside to other nations, but you were not to do this to your own brethren. And again, we see that laid out in Old Testament law. But what we recognize is the fact that sin made Nehemiah angry. He was angry whenever he heard this outcry. And why was he angry? Well, because it was sinful what was being done. That which what we can take from that is the understanding that whenever sin is present, that is something that we can be angry about, right? Something that is causing a separation from God. That is a righteous indignation. But I want you to pay attention to how he responded. He was angry at it, but what was this something he heard about it, and the first thing that came to his mind, he just lashed out? No. What do we read there in verse 7? After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, it wasn't that he didn't rebuke them and didn't call them out for their sin, and it wasn't that he wasn't angry at all, but what he did is he didn't just act out. What he did is he gave it serious thought, and that's something that we need to understand and we need to make application to our life. And we see that with Nehemiah, a great leader, somebody who recognizes sin is going on, and because of that angers him. But he didn't act out in a way in which was sinful. What he did is he took time, he gave serious thought to it, and then he handled it after giving serious thought. And that's something that we can take a lesson from and that we need to apply to our lives. Because so many times we get going through and we do the opposite of what we see in Ephesians 4:26 and Psalm 4:4, which is be angry and do not sin. We sin. We lash out. Or in James 1:19 and 20, where we see, so then, my brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. We can't just be angry just to be angry and lash out in those types of things. What we need to do is whenever these things happen, and again, sin is going to a separation of God, that's something that is okay to be angry with. But we need to make sure that we are reacting to that and handling ourselves in a proper way. And Nehemiah, a great leader, shows us how to do it. How do you do that? You give it some serious thought. You think about how you're going to handle this situation. And he did. And again, whenever he thought about how he was going to handle it, he didn't sweep that sin under the rug. He didn't make it to where, that's not a big deal. But he handled it after giving it serious thought and consideration and being mindful and prayerful to God. And so we see that, and we see what he tells them. Again, he rebukes them for it. Each of you is exacting usury against his brother. And then he goes on and asks them these series of questions and these different things and calls them out for their sin. And I want you to notice their response to it there at the end of verse 8. It says, then they were silenced and found nothing to say. Whenever Nehemiah was angry because of this sin, gave it some serious thought and gave it a proper reaction to it and laid out there to them a very logical argument and showing them what they're doing is wrong, they had no way to respond to it. They were silenced and found nothing to say. And that's one of the things that we need to take into consideration whenever we react to various situations, various things go on. If I just react in the initial way that comes to my mind, oftentimes it's not going to come out right. It's going to come out wrong. And oftentimes it's just going to cause the other individual to use that against us and react in some way, shape, or form likewise. But what do we see here with these individuals? When Nehemiah lays it out there for them, after he gave it some serious thought and serious consideration, they were silenced. They had nothing to say. And then he continued there in verse 9, what you are doing is not good. One of the things I want to point out here in verse 9, should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? We will talk a little bit more about the fear of God a little bit later, but understand that that is something that we as children of God need to do. We need to be ones who fear God, and we need to walk that way. We need to live our life in such a way in which we are fearing God. We fear him because of who he is, his power. We fear him because of his ability. We fear him because of his judgments and all those types of things. But we also fear him in the sense that we have that respect and reverence for him. And because we have that respect and reverence for him and who he is and all those sorts of things, we're not going to go against his law. Again, that is what these people were doing. Make no mistake about it. What they were doing was doing that which was not according to God's law. And so they weren't acting in a way of fear. They weren't walking and living in a way of fear. You know, you think of Ecclesiastes chapter 12:13, right? Fear God and keep his commandments. Whenever you fear God and you have that proper fear, you're going to keep his commandments. And that's one of the things that we recognize was not happening. Nehemiah also goes on to talk about and explain the fact that he was lending money to his brethren, grain, and he tells them to please stop this usury, please stop what you are doing and restore. Again, it's not just a matter of, and we make this point often, but it wasn't just that, you could just say, okay, I'm sorry, and move on, just stop and not do anything. They had to then make it right. And he asked them to restore it. And that's what we're going to see them doing as we look at verses 12 through 13. So they said, starting in verse 12, we will restore it, and we require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Then I called the priest and required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. Then I shook out the fold of my garment and said, so may God shake out each man from his house and from this property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen, and praise the Lord. Then the people did according to this promise. So they said they're going to do it. Nehemiah wanted a little bit more, so we see this oath that is taken. And then Nehemiah tells them and says, if anybody goes against this oath that they've made, if anybody goes against this thing that we've said, then let each of them be punished for it. Is essentially what he's saying. And then they concluded and said, Amen. I want you to recognize what they did. They praised the Lord. And that's what happens whenever we correct a wrong. Whenever we correct sin, praising the Lord. A lot of times we think, we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to call people out because it's going to hurt feelings. It's going to do these different things and all those different things. And a lot of justification goes on to where we won't call out sin. We won't tell somebody that they're in sin or what they have done is wrong and that they need to correct that wrong. But we see time and time again throughout the Old Testament and the New, throughout the entire Bible, whenever somebody is in sin and whenever they've repented of that, whenever they've made the corrections and they've corrected their wrong, there is a praising of the Lord. There is that goes along with it. And without that correction, the praising would not happen. Correction is one in which the Lord is going to be praised. You are now back in that right relationship with him. And that's what we see these people doing. They're praising him, and the people did according to the promise, is what the scripture tells us. We then get into verses 14 through 19 to wrap up chapter 5. And we're reading, moreover, from that time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. 12 years neither I nor my brethren ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me, and again, this is Nehemiah explaining this, but the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued to work on this wall. We did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me. And once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. And so what we see here and what we recognize is Nehemiah making this, I don't necessarily want to call it a plea, but telling, stating the things that he has done to help this people. Really what we see Nehemiah is he didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to be a burden to the work that was going on here. He didn't want to be a burden to the people. He wanted to be one that was what was helpful in these efforts. And one of the reasons why we see that he didn't do so, contrary to the governors that were before him, is because he says there in verse 15 at the end of it, because of the fear of God. Again, I know I kind of laid that out earlier and I talked a little bit about it, but the fear of God is something good. Something that is good. You know, there are people out there that might want to talk about the fact that I don't want to fear God and why do I need to fear God and those types of things? I mean, I have a loving God. Why would I fear him? The fear of the Lord is good, and that's exactly what we see Nehemiah laying out. He tells those who are wrong that they need to fear God, right? Walk in the fear of God. And then he says the reason why he's doing what he did was because of the fear of God. This is healthy for an obedient servant of God to be one that's fearful of him and the one that has the proper reverent fear for him. You read in Genesis 22, verse 12, whenever Abraham was offering up his son Isaac, and he was at the point where he was offering him. He was about to slay him, and the angel of the Lord came and stopped him. And if you remember, one of the things that the angel said was the fact that I now know you that you fear God. Why? Because you are obedient to him. And Abraham's fear, that fear that was shown in the fact that he was going to do exactly what God said because he had that reverence and that respect for him and for who he was, led to obedience, which we read in James 2, verse 22, made his faith perfect. Okay? And so we recognize that, a healthy fear of God for who he is, the power that he is, the judgment that he has. We see that throughout the book of, or throughout the various Psalms that are there. But not only that, that respect and that reverence to him and that authority that he is. And we submit to it in an obedient way. It is healthy, and it is something that we must have. Again, Ecclesiastes 12, fear God and keep his commandments. So he says that he had this fear, and that's why he's not going to be a burden to these people. He didn't require these various provisions or anything like that. Neither did his servants. But one of the other things I wanted to point out that they did here in verse 16, indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered. And what were they gathered there for at the end of verse 16? They were gathered there for work. That's what they were there for. They did not buy any land, and all the servants were gathered there for the work. They had a single focus, is what I'm trying to point out here. Not only did Nehemiah want to be a hindrance to the others working, but he and his servants were there for one purpose. It wasn't to be and to make themselves into this great all power and getting all these different things as a result of that, completing this wall and then being king, which we're going to see in a little bit. He says, that's what the enemies were trying to say that he was doing in order to stir up some trouble there. But what they were there for is they were there for work. And this is something that, can and needs to be applied to our lives, especially whenever we look a little bit later, whenever we get there, and we look at the fact that, Nehemiah and his servants and those working, they continue and complete this wall in 52 days, which is just astonishing. And we'll look at that in Nehemiah 6:15. But that mindset to work, having that mind to work, we've noted that in Nehemiah before, and we see that that's why they're here. To have that single focus to get the work of the Lord done. And that is something that we need to do and make application to our life. To have that single focus. Yes, we still have to live our lives. Yes, we still have jobs and need to get paid to support our families in those ways. Just like these people needed to be fed and gather food and different things. But they had one single focus, and that was the work of the Lord. And that's what we need to do. You do that which you need to do to support your family, but that's not your end-all be-all. Your end-all be-all, what you are after, is a single mindset to do the work for the Lord. That's what these people do. Okay. Then we also see that he's going to prepare meals for his workers. Even with all this going on, he did not ask for the governor's provisions and provided out of his own means. Again, that goes and speaks to his mindset to do the work for the Lord and to get this done. He didn't ask for these things and didn't seek out those provisions. He wanted the work of the Lord to not be hindered in any way, and he wanted that wall to be built. And because of that leadership, we see that they get this wall done. And in the end, like we said earlier, he asked God to remember him for this good that he had done. And one of the things that I do want to point out real quick is it's not some type of merit-based, hey, remember this good, my God, that I have done according to the law I've done for this people, so then I can go do whatever I want in my life and my good outweighs the bad. That's not what he's talking about here. He's making that proclamation to remember me, my God, for good according to all that I have done for this people. Not so that I can go out and go live however I want. And we need to be careful and make sure that we don't take it as such. This is no doubt an important lesson for us to learn that we see here throughout Nehemiah chapter 5. Looking at the time here, I need to kind of speed it up here, trying to get through chapter 6. So we'll go ahead and get into chapter 6. But Nehemiah chapter 5, again, coming off 4, they're working, right? They're building. And then in chapter 5, there's this issue. These people are saying, man, we're trying to build, but we don't have any money. We don't have any food. Our children are being sold into slavery, and we're borrowing and all these things. And it's our own people. So he deals with that issue. And then we get to Nehemiah chapter 6, and he has another issue that he's going to deal with. And once again, we see the enemies that he has out there coming to him and trying to stir up trouble. We see here in verse 1, now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of the enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I'm doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? But they sent to me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. And so we see that once again, those same individuals that in the beginning, and those enemies that were trying to get them and make fun of them and to try to cause them to be weak in their work and not even get to this point in the wall, they're back again as they see this wall progressing and as they see this wall being built, and they're trying to get him to come down. One, if we remove Nehemiah, then that leader isn't there to help this job, to help this build along, and it can really do detriment to the people. Then we might be able to work our way in there. But 2, Nehemiah states the fact that they were meaning to do him harm. They weren't meaning just to remove him for that period of time, but to potentially and possibly permanently remove him. Okay? And so after that exchange 4 different times, and Nehemiah giving the same response, we then see them up the threats, if you will. We see here in verse 5, then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand, and in it was written, and here's what was written. It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall, that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king. So come, therefore, and let us consult together. So initially, they're just trying to get him to come down, right? Just saying, hey, come down, let's talk, we see all these things. And now, because they're getting that answer of no, I'm not going to come down there. I'm not going to leave this work of the wall. It's a great work that I'm doing, and I need to be here for it. They try to plant fear in him, that they're going to go tell the king what's going on, and the fact that, hey, we're hearing that y'all are planning to rebel, which, if you remember, right, this is something similar that we saw back in Ezra whenever they were initially starting to rebuild the temple. And I believe it was Ezra chapter 4 where we see that. A letter written saying, hey, this is a rebellious people. If you allow them to rebuild the temple, then they're just going to rebel against you. Well, this is the same type of tactic that they are using from the standpoint of that letter was sent to the king, and the king actually stopped the building of the wall. But this one is telling Nehemiah, hey, if you don't come meet with us, this is what we're going to tell the king. And again, it was the same type of thing, that you plan to rebel. And I want you to notice what they did. What they did is, all they say is, hey, we're hearing that you're planning to rebel, and so we're going to jump to this conclusion that is why you're building this wall, right? Is so that, the wall is rebuilt, so you guys have fortification, and the fact that you're going to be placed as king, and then you're therefore going to rebuild. And remember, they jump to this conclusion. We'll pay attention to Nehemiah's response to that. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they all were trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will be done, and it will not be done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. And so that's what we recognize. Nehemiah told them that this was not going on. This is not what's going to happen. And in fact, he said, you invent them in your own heart. And we recognize that whenever we look back at the statement that's made. Hey, we hear that you're rebelling. First of all, who's saying that you're rebelling, right? And he gives a couple names, but hey, we're hearing that you're rebelling, and that's why you're building this wall. And so what we see there in him pulling out and telling them, what Nehemiah is telling them is, you made this thing up. You invent this in your heart. That's not what's going on. You don't have the facts. And this is sometimes a tactic that Satan will use on us. People will make stuff up, and they will pull things from anywhere. They'll pull things out of nowhere to make us fear and to stop doing the work of the Lord. They'll come up with some crazy thing as to what's going on, and it has no validity. It has no truth in it. It might be based off something that you can visually see from the standpoint of, okay, I see a wall's being built, therefore you are rebuilding, so then that way you can be a king and rebel and all these types of things. But there is no actual validity in it, and we need to understand that people are going to do that to us and in our lives. And that's one of Satan's tactics. That fear, that scare tactic to stop and to hinder the work of the Lord. And one of the other things I want to point out is making sure that we understand that we too need to make sure that we don't invent things in our own heart. Now, I know we're talking about the enemies of the work of the Lord, but we need to make sure that whenever we are going to present something like a letter, like they were, that we have facts to back it up, and that we're not just making it up, we're not inventing it in our own heart, but that there is always evidence there. It's kind of a side point, not necessarily great application from this, but you see that that's what these individuals were doing. They were making up something. They came to a conclusion with no evidence. We need to be careful as well that we don't invent something because that's what we want it to be, or we're trying to get people to do what these people were, which was just be afraid and lie and have no evidence for the things that we present. We see what their end goal was, though. Their end goal was to make them afraid. Their end goal was to make them afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in the work of the Lord and it will not be done. And so that is the goal whenever people are trying to say these types of things that really have no validity. Again, there might be some form of semblance of, okay, I see a wall's being built. I see these people are trying to build back up their city and their wall, their civilization, if you will. But that's about as far as the truth in whatever it is they're saying is. And so we need to understand that that's what they're doing, and their whole effort is to weaken the work of the Lord, and so that it will not be done. This is what Satan is trying to do. But pay attention to Nehemiah's response. Nehemiah's response is that he turned to God, and he turned again, because he's done it multiple times. We saw it in Nehemiah 5, we saw it in Nehemiah 4, and we've seen it throughout. That's his character. I'm going to turn to God. God's where my strength is. Again, this right here is in complete contrast to what we see there in Ezra chapter 4. Because in Ezra chapter 4, a similar claim was made. Now, that one was actually sent to the king, but a similar claim was made. And whenever that claim was made and it came back and the king shut him down, those there in Ezra chapter 4 lacked the faith, at least at that point in time. A little bit later, after the work of a couple of prophets, we see them rebuilding. But at that point in time, they didn't have the faith, they didn't have the trust to continue the work. And so that's what we see them doing in Ezra. They were too afraid, did not have the faith to continue. That's contrary to what we see with Nehemiah. Nehemiah's faith was in God. And as a result, what does he do? And what do? They continue the work of the Lord. When others try to weaken our faith, we must turn to God, because that is where our source of strength is. These individuals had a mind to work, yes. But understand that it wasn't just their mind to work that got it done. What got this wall done and why they continued to push through was, one, because of the leadership they had with Nehemiah. But they understood where their strength actually came from. They had a mind to work, but their strength and their ability to work and their protection and their assistance and who actually provided to be able to allow them to get that done was God. Let us never forget that. In this country, and especially within our culture that we see, We have that work ethic, be a hard worker, I can get it done, all those types of things. And those are good characteristics and traits, but you can never forget who allows you to get it done and where your strength comes from. You be a hard worker. You have that mind to work. But the reason why you're able to get it accomplished is because the Lord is the one that's strengthening your hand. That's what Nehemiah recognized. This is an important lesson for us to understand as we look at our own life and make the application there. We see then in Nehemiah 6, 10 through 14, after Nehemiah, tells them that afterward, the enemies are not going to quit, is really what we see. And we see here starting in verse 10, afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the door of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. And I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way and sin, so that they might have a cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who have made me afraid. We see all those working together, hired prophet and prophetesses, and Tobiah and Sanballat and the other enemies. Again, what they're trying to do, they don't come against them and try and kill them, but they're trying to make them afraid. And again, this was something that Nehemiah sees here, that there is a secret informer, and his response is, why should I as a man hide? He perceived that God had sent that God was not the one that sent the prophet, but that he was hired by the enemies that he might send, that he can bring an evil report. Nehemiah takes a stand once again, not succumbing to that fear. And I think a lot of that goes back to where his fear truly was. His fear wasn't in these men and what these men can do. His fear was in God, and he was not going to do anything that was going to cause him to sin against God and that was going to hinder the work of the Lord. And we see that mindset that Nehemiah has, and it serves him well throughout his life and throughout this time. And then he requests of God to remember those who were against him. We then get to the end of this chapter, and we see, starting in verses 15 through 19, that the wall was finished on the 25th day of Yule in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. Also in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to me. For many in Judah were pledged to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds before me, and reported my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. One of the things that we see, and there's been various sermons that preach from that at the very beginning of this section, is in 52 days, that's how long it took for the wall to be finished. And so we recognize that, and we recognize how they were able to get that done. An entire wall around the city, and I don't have the statistics of how big it was and all those types of things, but you can imagine the task to build one of those walls in that day and time. No doubt the one that allowed them to do that was God, but it was because they had that mind to work. And what was the work that they were doing? Was it selfish work, a work for themselves? No, it was a work for God. And so when we have that mind to work, and we know that the strength and the ability to do that work comes from God, and it's a work that benefits God, amazing things are accomplished, and that's what we see here. And whenever the enemies hear about it, it makes them fear. And all the nations around us saw these, they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by who? We were the ones that were hammering away or building all those types of things, but who was it done by? It was done by God. And it wasn't just because they said it was done by God. This is what the enemies recognize, because it was done in such such a small amount of time, and done in such a way that it was clear and evident who was behind them. As a result of it, made them fear. And we see what's going on throughout this. Tobiah is one of the names that we've seen throughout, as one that's been trying to hinder this work. And he even has some insiders within Judah, those that were writing letters back and forth, saying what's going on and all those types of things, and giving different responses. And the whole point of these letters that Tobiah sent was to frighten Nehemiah, to get him to be scared, to change course, to not continue the work of the Lord. Brethren, that is what Satan's going to do. Whenever Satan sees a work going forth, he is going to try to have this fear, this scare tactic, to try to get that to stop. And we can't succumb to it. We don't fear Satan. We don't fear man. Who we fear is God. And if we do that and have that heart to mind to work, amazing things can be accomplished for the Lord. And that's what we see here in Nehemiah chapters 5 and Nehemiah chapter 6. We will stop and wrap up class there tonight. We will pick up with Nehemiah chapter 7 and try to get through Nehemiah chapter 10 next Wednesday. I hope this study has been helpful. I hope this study was one that was beneficial. If you have any questions about it, you can reach out to me. Let me know. And hope you have a great rest of your evening. Hope you have a great